So welcome everyone to our fourth session in our webinar series on how to grow peace journalism. Today's session is going to look at the issue of how solutions journalism can help contribute to this issue. We have an amazing panel together today on all experts on solutions journalism. So with that, I will pass it on to our moderator, Vanessa Basile.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Babak. So we're going to listen to our three panelists today. They have 10 minutes to present the work, and then we're going to open the floor for Q&A at the end. We're going to start with Kaiser Glo, who's our first panelist today. He's an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Georgia in the US. He teaches and researches visual communication and solution journalism. Prior to being in academia, he spent 10 years as a photojournalist, reporter, and public relations practitioner. So, Kaiser, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I am going to start with something that you'll probably see and hear a lot more about from all three of us today. But I just wanted to kind of start with a general definition of solutions journalism, so that we can be thinking about that as we talk about it and peace journalism. But in short, solutions journalism is rigorous reporting about how people are responding to social problems. And the four key elements of this that we look for are response, limitations, evidence, and insight. And this is based off of work done by the Solutions Journalism Network, who you'll be hearing from later on. But they develop these four qualities as a way to try and help distinguish solutions journalism from other types of reporting, especially, I believe, just general good news reporting that didn't have much substance behind it, other than just being a nice story. And so from the four qualities you can see here, it's featuring not just a person, but an actual response to a problem and how it happened. It's providing evidence of results and looking at the effectiveness of these and not just intention. So you'll see already it's reporting on tangible things that are being ideas of what could be done. And then it discusses limitations and avoids hype. So that's how we kind of get it away from being just a general puff piece. And perhaps most importantly, it seeks to provide insights others can learn from, not just inspiration. And so essentially, it's compelling reporters to go one step beyond just reporting on problems a society is facing, but to instead go out and say, well, who's doing something about it, and report on that. Because by learning about what others are doing in society, we can maybe feel less helpless about the world or less beaten down by problem after problem after problem that we're seeing, because we're also seeing what fellow citizens are doing or trying to do in order to solve that problem. I'm going to talk primarily about some of the research work that I've done, especially with my collaborator, Karen McIntyre, who you'll hear from later on. But I want to start with a shame promotion. I keep a public bibliography of solutions journalism and constructive journalism research that you'll see I only have 5 from 2024. I still need to update with some of the latest work, but there are more than 100 studies in here that you can search for by topic, by author, by year. I'm starting to put keywords in. Any type of academic research that you could be interested in English and other languages, I keep here. And so if you're interested in seeing what other research is out there, I highly recommend that link. Put it in the chat. I want to start with one of my favorite examples of solutions visual journalism, because as Vanessa said, my main intersection here is between solutions journalism and visual journalism, mainly photojournalism, because solutions visual journalism is really good at showing the how. Remember, this has to be an actual response. All responses aren't typically as visual as this, which is a man who dresses up as a superhero to help with pedestrian safety. So in Mexico City, if you stop your car on a crosswalk, which makes it dangerous for pedestrians he will come and your car out of the way, which I love this photo because you can see the problem and the response in one image, and it gives us a nice visualization of what's going on. But in my research with Dr. We've found, though, that oftentimes the visuals aren't necessarily focused on the response. we know that problem-oriented visuals and conflict visuals in particular can be more attention-getting to the audience. And so oftentimes we will see solution stories, but at the top we'll have a picture of problem, which in some ways is good because it can help us understand very quickly what the problem is before we get to the solution. But some of our work has been investigating this from kind of a messaging standpoint. What happens when you have a dominant visual that shows a problem and a dominant text that shows the response? And so from one of our earlier experiments in 2018, we found, and you'll see here our experimental stimuli, we had a solution story that was paired with either a conflict photo, a neutral photo, or a solution-oriented photo that was congruent to what was listed in the story. And on the left, you'll see kind of these two interesting findings from when readers saw the conflict-oriented visual with the solution story. They had a much more negative feeling coming out of that, but they also were much more willing to act, which we thought was very interesting, that it did drive readers more likely to do something about it, but at what cost emotionally? And as Karen will talk about later, emotion has been a really interesting thing that we've seen in the way readers or viewers consume solutions journalism. One of the other things that we've tried to do a lot of is talk to the journalists who are doing this work. And so early on in our research in this, we tried to interview as many journalists as possible that had been doing solutions journalism work to try and understand, yes, we have the Solutions Journalism Network's definition of this and what they say it is and what it isn't, but what about the journalists that have done this training and are now out there doing it? Do they have a different way of conceptualizing this? Are they finding something different when they're actually putting it into practice? And so we interviewed a bunch of journalists and looked at it from a kind of a hierarchy of influences approach, where we looked at from an individual level to routines to media organization and social institutional level to see just what they thought about it, which included thoughts that it complemented investigative journalism. It was a natural second step to it. There's a lot of talk about objectivity still within this, and advocacy, and journalists who are saying, I'm doing this to be an advocate, and journalists saying, I will never use this for advocacy. But one of the interesting things at the bottom with the individual and routine practices is we asked, what's the difference between your regular reporting and when you're doing solutions reporting? And they said the process is the same. We're doing the exact same type of journalism we've always been doing. It's changed our habits of thought. When we're approaching the stories, we're thinking about it differently. We're starting to think about solutions early on and having to build a lot more time on the front end to trying to figure this out. This led us to a second study where we conceptualized and operationalized solutions journalism for the research world. I know this is a wall of text. I just copied it out of our paper, which you can see below, and which I'd be happy to send to anyone who'd be interested. But what we tried to do again was take those four qualities and take what the journalist told us and try and build a larger framework that could be useful to academics, especially who are trying to study this. This has been adapted and grown and modified by other scholars since then, which is wonderful. But it gave us kind of a start into how do we take what an organization has put out and take what journalists are doing and take the academic world and smash it all together. But the thing that I'm most excited about is what we've been doing in the realm of education, because we've been seeing solutions journalism education entering collegiate curriculum. In fact, the very first solutions journalism journal article was about education and teaching it in the college classroom. And there have been several studies since then. The SJN has a curriculum builder for professors who want to put together a unit or a course with solutions journalism. They've run educators academies with the University of Oregon for several years. They've started or they ran educator academies for HSIs and HBCUs in the last several years. And they've established or named 4 solutions journalism hubs around the United States, which are institutions who are doing a lot of the work there. And again, shameless self-promotion, University of Georgia is one of those. But What we ended up doing here, and this is something that is fresh. We are in the final stages of this, which is why I don't have much of a citation below other than the title. But what we ended up doing was interviewed former students who are now practitioners. So folks who learned about solutions journalism in college, but then it's been several years since then, to ask them, what did you think about solutions journalism when you first encountered it? And what do you think about it now? And one of the wonderful things that we saw was that their first impressions were really interesting. It for a lot of them, it aligned with their personal philosophies and it impacted their personal journey. And one of the big things here that I think I would assume is going to be very resonant with peace journalism is that a lot of these students said I was burnt out on journalism. I was getting ready to give up on journalism. I was tired of the same old hard news, problem focused. When I heard about solutions journalism, that brought me right back in, which we thought was really, really interesting to kind of hear those perspectives from students. And then as they transitioned into the workplace, we saw again the difference between learning about it and doing it. Their perceptions didn't really change, but they told us a lot about how their nuances and practicality of the approach evolved. They actually tried to put it into practice. And one of the other interesting things we saw was that they said that we might not necessarily still be doing solutions journalism, but we're using those skills in all of our reporting. So it's not just whole story reporting that they're getting. It's more of kind of whole story reporter that they're being. So I want to stop here so that we have time for everything, but happy to talk further and thank y'all for your time.
Thank you very much, Kaiser. You're really right on time. Thank you for your very exciting presentation. We're going to go next to our second panelist for today, Karen McIntyre. She's an associate professor of multimedia journalism and the director of the graduate studies at the Richard Robertson School of Media and Culture at Virginia Commonwealth University. She teaches and researches constructive journalism and solution journalism and has co-edited a book on the topic. And she was the first to introduce the concept of constructive journalism to the academic literature in her dissertation in 2015. And she also studies press freedom and journalism practice in East Africa. And Karen was also a journalist before starting her academic career. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Kaiser. Wow, you were really good at sticking to 10 minutes. I'm just going to warn you now, I'm going to go just a little bit over, but not more than like 2 minutes over. So I thought it would be kind of fun to show you this little model that that I developed with Catherine Guildenstead, who presented last week in the constructive journalism session. Almost 10 years ago, we made this model about how we think about constructive journalism and how it relates to these other approaches like peace journalism and solutions journalism. And the way we thought of it was that constructive journalism is like a tree and it has many branches because there are lots of different ways to practice being more constructive in news reporting. And so peace journalism is like one specific way to be more constructive. So that's one branch of the tree. And solutions journalism is another specific way to be more constructive. And that's a branch of the tree. And there are other branches and then we put civic journalism down in the roots of the tree because we think all of these approaches have foundations in civic journalism. Anyway, I just thought it might be kind of fun to look at how we thought about that almost 10 years ago and if maybe that's changed at all. And I wonder if you would think about it similarly. But I'm going to focus today talking more about the development of solutions journalism. So, Kaiser talked about the definition, and I'll say when in my research, I used the definition borrowed by the Solutions Journalism Network, which has changed a little bit over the years, but rigorous reporting on responses to social problems, I think, was the original definition, and one that I still stick with, of course, combined with the 4 qualities. But I'll talk about how solutions journalism has developed, and I'll do that by mentioning 3 studies that I've worked on. And then I'm going to pose lots of questions, tell you some things we learned, and then ask some questions about how it might relate to peace journalism. And so maybe one of these questions I ask will stick with you, and we can talk about it in the question and answer section. So the first study I want to talk about, the first two studies I did with Kaiser, and this one was a systematic review of solutions journalism and constructive journalism research. So we gathered all the articles we could find that had been published up through 2020, and this included journal articles, but also the PhD dissertations and master's theses, and there were 94 articles altogether. So we wanted to just kind of get a lay of the land and see how this research field had developed. So I'll share some of my findings and then pose some questions. So we found that basically starting in about 2015, there was just an upward trajectory of research on this topic. In 2019, the most articles were published. And we saw a dip in 2020, but we're wondering if that was because of COVID. So I think, Kaiser, we need to repeat this and see what's happened in the last, will have been 5 years, and see. My guess is that probably the research on this has been an upward trajectory since 2020 as well. This research on solutions and constructive journalism had been published in 37 different journals. The two journals that published the most on this topic were Journalism and Journalism Practice. And we found that the research was international, not nearly to the extent as peace journalism, but the first authors of these studies came from 19 different countries, and the content, they studied solutions journalism in this particular context, represented 23 different countries. We found that 54% of these papers referred to solutions journalism as a form of constructive journalism. So that's like consistent with this tree model. And 11% thought of them as the same thing. We found that about half of the articles studied the process and the production of solutions in constructive journalism. 30% looked at the effects of these approaches. 11% were just purely conceptual, and 6% were something else, like, for example, an introduction to a special journal issue. The methods were pretty evenly split between qualitative and quantitative, and a decent amount used mixed methods. And theoretically, these papers were pretty weak, but the most commonly used theoretical or conceptual frameworks were positive psychology, social responsibility theory, framing, and generally like normative roles or normative standards in journalism. So share some lessons that we learned from this, and then maybe pose some questions as they relate to peace journalism. So we think that solutions and constructive journalism work should be internationalized more so. And like I mentioned, certainly peace journalism already is. And so, I'm curious, what have been the benefits of, having peace journalism be so widespread in so many different countries, but also what have the challenges been of that? Because I, already see challenges of using constructive or solutions journalism in other countries, specifically developing countries. And we feel like there needs to be more research on the effects and the theory behind solutions and constructive journalism. So I'm wondering what conceptual frameworks are most commonly used in peace journalism research. I imagine framing is pretty common, but what else? Is there any overlap? We also think a consistent definition is important for researchers. And I'm wondering, does peace journalism have a consistent definition among researchers? And how is peace journalism situated in the larger field? Is it the tree in and of itself? Is it a branch? So things to think about. And then lastly, I know there's been a systematic review of peace journalism and a meta-analysis I saw too. And I'm wondering, what did they reveal? Any overlap between the findings there and the findings here? The second article I want to mention is a continuation of the systematic review, but this time we took just the experimental effects studies and looked at them to see what effects solutions and constructive journalism stories have. So this included 22 experiments. Again, these were all the experiments that we could find published up through 2020. And the big takeaway from this study, as Kaiser alluded to before, is that solutions and constructive news stories make people feel more positive. There were 17 of the 22 experiments that looked at emotion or affect, and in every single one of them, these stories made audiences feel more positive or less negative. All of the other variables had mixed effects. We looked at self-efficacy, we looked at behavioral intentions, we looked at actual behaviors, other things too, like trust, and either there were very mixed findings or just not enough research to be able to make any substantial conclusions. So some lessons we learned from this and some questions as it relates to peace journalism. We think that we should look at affect as a mediator. So do solutions journalism and maybe peace journalism stories impact engagement only because of the positive affect that they evoke? Or is there some other mechanism that's unique to solutions journalism or peace journalism that is causing effects? I think, was it Tanya last week who mentioned that peace journalism stories make people feel good? So I think we have this in common. We also think that there should be more longitudinal work because it's possible that some effects, like actual behavior change, might occur over time and take more than like reading a single story to have an impact. And we think other variables need to be studied because they might explain the conditions in which solutions journalism or peace journalism stories impact audiences. So, for example, how relevant is the story to my own life? Or what is the topic? Are there specific topics that these approaches lend themselves to? And then lastly, we think there needs to be more diverse participant pools. So in our research, every study except for one used participants from the US or Europe. And I wonder if peace journalism studies have used a more diverse participant pools, and have they found any differences based on like culture or context. And then lastly, I want to just talk briefly about some research that I've done on solutions journalism and constructive journalism in East Africa. So in our systematic review, Kaiser and I found that only 5% of publications concerned these approaches in Africa. Yet there are nonprofits like Solutions Journalism Network, Constructive Institute, and several others that have been training journalists in Africa in many countries. And so clearly the topics are growing there. So I surveyed 423 journalists in Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya in 2019 and asked them, are you familiar with these topics or with these concepts, solutions journalism and constructive journalism? If so, how do you define these? And do journalists in your country practice these, and should they? So I found that 38% of these journalists had heard of the term solutions journalism. Many more, 55%, had heard of the term constructive journalism. They defined the concepts largely in the same way that Western scholars and practitioners do, with some exceptions, and mostly those were relating it to development journalism. When I asked, do journalists in your country practice solutions or constructive journalism, they pretty overwhelmingly said yes. 90% of journalists said yes, it's practiced here in Rwanda, 80% in Uganda, 70% in Kenya, but with like a big qualifier. They all said basically that it's like not done well. They said, it's only practiced a bit at 50% at a low level, not up to the standards, etc. And then I asked, well, should it be practiced in your country? And overwhelmingly, people said, yes, it can help society, help solve problems, help development, etc. But a few journalists, mostly in Kenya and in Uganda, expressed concern that it could be used as a tool for government. It could overshadow critical reporting. They also said that they don't have the time or resources, which of course is something we've heard in the US as well. So finally, just two quick additional questions. I'm wondering, can or should solutions journalism or peace journalism means something different in different contexts? Is there a universal definition of peace journalism? Is it implemented the same way in all countries? Should it be? And lastly, could solutions journalism or peace journalism be hijacked? And what I mean by that is, could authoritarian governments, manipulate the media into supporting their agenda under the guise of peace journalism or solutions journalism? And is that something we should be concerned about? So I hope maybe one of the many questions that I posed stuck with you, and we can talk about it after Tina's presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, for your very insightful presentation. We're going to move now to our third and final panelist today, Tina Rosenberg. She's the co-founder of the Solution Journalism Network. She's a longtime New York Times writer for the editorial page, Sunday Magazine, and is also the co-author of the Fixes column. She has written hundreds of magazine articles and 3 books. Her work has won the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Awards for nonfiction. Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And it is really a pleasure to have listened to and learned from the very insightful presentations from Kaiser and Karen. And thank you all for being here. I also want to note the presence of Catherine Gildenstadt, who is one of the constructive journalism pioneers in Europe and has been very important to the development of this field as well. So I want to start by talking about a very important tool that is available to all, and that is the Solutions Story Tracker from the Solutions Journalism Network. This SJN is a 10-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we are basically a network building and supporting and training organization. We're not a destination site. We don't do solutions journalism ourselves, although many of us do on the side or in other jobs, or it came from places where we did it. But we do collect stories. And we have a couple of actual human beings whose job every week is to look around and see and find solution stories that were recently published. This is by no means a comprehensive collection of solution stories. We have no idea what % of the universe of solution stories that are published end up in our tracker. It's probably a very small %. Nevertheless, we have almost 16,000 stories in there right now, and it's highly searchable. And I want to show you just a little bit about how to use it. You can type in a keyword here, or you can go to advanced search. And let us go to advanced search and look for location of response. And I'm going to type in Ukraine and see what we have. And here we go. We have 42 stories in Ukraine, set in Ukraine. You can also search by many other ways, including the location of the journalist, whether it's student journalism, the platform, the length of the story, the date, issue areas, and then something I really like, which is success factors. These are sort of what makes this response work. It's a very interesting thing to tag for. What's the secret sauce of the response? So we have a lot of stories in here from Ukraine, and a lot of them are from a news organization called Rubrika, which is purely solutions focused. They're fairly new. They started, I think, since the war. They publish in Russian, Ukrainian, and in English. And the kinds of stories they do offer a good example of the kinds of stories one can do during a war. And a lot of these are about our war-related stories. For example, a battalion of grandmothers that is fighting, or volunteers who help people evacuate from cities. Okay, I'm going to close this and just talk here. Volunteers who evacuate people from cities, rescuing of paintings, rescuing of animals, but some of them don't have anything to do with war at all. And they are stories, for example, about programs for deaf Ukrainians. There's similar kinds of journalism done elsewhere in other conflict situations. Al Jazeera has done quite a bit of it. For example, Peace in the Tracker from Sudan, on how to use crowd safetying for civilian safety, piece about displaced Sri Lankans coming back after conflict to an island where they used to live. Waging Nonviolence has also done a lot of pieces that are in the tracker, one on unarmed civilians and how they're saving lives in Sri Lanka. There's an interesting story in Next City about how to rebuild a war-torn city, and starting in, I think it's set in Syria, which is start with the souk. CNN has pieces about teaching children in refugee camps in Arabic. So there's a lot of stories from various different news organizations that you can find in the tracker. And I want to talk briefly about something that Babak mentioned early on when we were planning this panel, which is why has solutions journalism been able to spread like this? And I think part of it is just the timing. Journalism is in crisis all over the world. We all know that. And I think one of the responses to that has been that a very defensive profession is open to new ideas, and solutions journalism is one of them. But I think it's also been able to spread because it has a very precise definition, as both Kaiser and Karen said. And it's defined in a way that allows journalists to think through their work and do these kinds of stories. And there are also systems for doing it. You're not just sort of looking around going, how do I find a story here? Because otherwise you could sort of feel like, when I talk to journalists about this, a lot of times their first reaction is, so I write about the uncorrupt cop? So I write about a mother and her baby in a park. Is that a solution story as opposed to writing about violence that used to take place in this park? And the answer is no, that's not how you do these stories, and those are not stories at all. Solution stories are about systemic improvement. As we all know, you cannot use this tool for covering breaking news. It is not a way to cover the battlefield. It is a tool for feature stories and enterprise stories. And these have to be about widely shared problems, because if a problem is widely shared, that means lots of different people have tried to solve it. And some of those responses are going to be more newsworthy than others. So when you look around for a solution story, the first thing you're going to do is say, what are some widely shared problems here in this conflict zone? And they can be conflict related or not conflict related. For example, one problem might be art is being destroyed, and the country's historical cultural patrimony is being destroyed. Okay, let's look at that, and let's look at who's doing a better job at solving that problem. And that is the key question of solutions journalism. Who's doing a better job? So you look around and see, are there programs that have been effective in saving art? And if there are, then you can go and report on them. And as Kaiser stressed, and Karen also, you need to report using the 4 qualities. And it's not a puff piece. It's got to talk about what are the limitations here, what's not working. Probably pretty easy to find. But nevertheless, it doesn't have to be a perfect program to be a good story. In fact, there's no such thing as a perfect program. And you won't have much credibility if you claim it's a perfect program. So embrace the limitations. Talk about what's not working about it. You'll have more credibility and authority. So, and it has to be a systemic response. Yes, you can do an investigative piece about a corrupt cop, but you can't do a solutions piece about a clean cop. What you can do a solutions piece about is a police jurisdiction that used to be corrupt and cleaned itself up. So systemic change is really key for a lot of solution stories. Individuals who are doing great things is not a solution story. It's about the work, and the work has to be a systemic response. So, I probably don't need to convince you of this if you come from the world of peace journalism, but a lot of times, Rubrika, for example, in Ukraine, gets questions about how can people read about this? Aren't these like 5-ounce stories in a situation with 5-ton problems, literally 5-ton problems in Ukraine falling on their heads? And the answer is people are desperate to read about these. I think you all know that. It's instinctive. We want to know. We need a respite from purely reading about war and destruction. And we need to know what is going on. Who's keeping the hospital open despite having no electricity? What is going on to teach children who are traumatized by war? I mean, these are super important questions. They're not small. They're big. They aren't the breaking news of the day necessarily, but it's an important thing to look at with journalism. So I think that I'll leave it there, and we can answer questions later on. But thank you for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Tina, very much. So yes, we're going to open the floor now for questions. I think there's already a question in the chat during the presentation of Karen. So the question is, does your constructive journalism frame cover all the branches from the tree in the first slide you shared, like peace journalism, good news, etc.?
The short answer is yes. Let me put it back up again so I can show you. Yes, but the positive journalism we put in a different spot. Catherine, I'm glad you're here because I was showing on my first slide this model that came out of our thinking almost 10 years ago now. And I'm curious whether you still feel this still holds. But peace journalism is this separate little, or I'm sorry, positive journalism is this separate little tree down below next to the big major tree, because that's something we think entirely different. Although because there's so much confusion and misunderstanding, like we should tell people where it goes. So that's why it's in the model at all. But yeah, the big constructive tree includes peace journalism, solutions journalism. In this model, we also have prospective journalism, which is like looking to the future, and restorative narrative, which is reporting on tragedies long after they've occurred, reporting on the reconstruction and resilience after tragedies. But these four are not the only four ways to be constructive, in my opinion. There are plenty of other branches that could be on the tree.
Karen, I don't think a lot of non-journalists understand the difference between positive journalism and the other more what we would call hard-hitting or legitimate forms of journalism. People lump them together, and that's fine. They don't have to know what the labels on all these things are.
Yeah, and I think in my opinion, the difference is that positive journalism is it makes people feel good, and it might make you laugh or smile or say, oh, it's like, think of fireman saves a cat from a tree kind of story, but it doesn't have any widespread social significance, which constructive journalism, peace journalism, solutions journalism stories do. I agree, it's not necessarily important for practitioners to know the different names, but I do think it's crucial for researchers to use a specific term. So that's been behind my work in trying to define them and figure out how they fit together.
Yeah, I wasn't meaning practitioners. I actually think it is kind of important for practitioners to understand what they're doing. I'm talking about news consumers.
Oh, yeah.
I want more positive news, and everything gets lumped into that category. That's what the Reuters Institute found.
Yeah. But does it, I don't know, does it matter? Because if they're consuming a solutions journalism story or peace journalism story, like they're going to get something out of that that's different than if they're consuming a positive news story. Maybe it doesn't matter whether they like recognize that difference or could put a label on it.
Good question. I think it's a much more important distinction for journalists, because a lot of journalists are allergic to positive news. They'll say that is not, that's soft. And I agree with that. I think there's a place for it, but it's not what we're talking about.
Okay, so if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand, and yeah.
I have a question. Yeah, thank you very much, first of all. Those are three amazing presentations. I think I learned a lot from each of them. I had a question. There was a comment suggesting that constructive journalism shouldn't be used for breaking news. And when we think about peace journalism, basically it's trying to promote a different way to cover conflicts and wars, ones that don't focus on sensationalism and drama and what blew up today and who got killed today. And replacing kind of victory framing from like who's winning, kind of like a horse race in elections, like who won today, who lost today, to what Galtung way back in 1965 said, we should switch victory framing for solutions framing. So how do those two how does that come together? How do we avoid doing the kind of horse race, who's winning, what blew up today, what exploded today, to a solutions framework without then making it kind of like a breaking news coverage?
It's an interesting question, and you're applying it to a different kind of war or conflict, which is political conflict. And we've been running some programs about how to cover elections in a different way that centers on the community and what the community is interested in, and what are the roots of those problems that the community is suffering, and what are solutions to them, rather than cover it as a horse race. I mean, as Jay Rosen says, covering the stakes, not the odds. But I think solutions journalism is a way to talk about big issues of our time, but usually they're second day stories or follow-up stories to breaking news. And so by definition, they're not pieces that have to be done by 5 o'clock today, or we're going to get scooped by somebody else. That's all I mean by that. It's not a way to cover what Trump said today. It's not a way to cover, the advance of the Russian army, that kind of thing.
Thank you so much.
Any other question? Yeah, Babak?
That was it. Thank you very much. That's my question. If there's another one, I could ask another one, actually. I'm just very curious how research and practice overlaps in solutions journalism, because we have some researchers, and also you've all been probably at different times, if I understand, where you were journalists, you're practitioners, and there's obviously all this practice of solutions journalism going on. So how do the two work together in this field, practice and research?
This is the age-old question. And I feel like we're constantly trying to bridge the gap, to use a cliche, between the academia and the research. I mean, I think by having conferences that bring the two together, that could be helpful. I mean, the Constructive Institute, I think, has done that well with their conference, their constructive journalism conference that has been highly focused on practitioners as well. I mean, like Kaiser and I just try to have a relationship with people like Tina or people at the SJN, and, tell them about our research findings, reach out to them to help, ask them for help connecting us with practitioners for our research. And so we try to do it that way. I know that's on a smaller scale, but I don't know, Kaiser or Tina has more to add to that.
Yeah, it's like journalism, period. Journalism research. It's trying to make sure that we're staying connected with the industry and vice versa. And part of that is through our research of trying to involve real newsrooms and real journalists. We followed the Montgomery Advertiser as they implemented solutions journalism into their reporting, and kind of talked with the editor and tracked any kind of audience change over time. Interviews with journalists, but also in the classroom. I think that's where we're trying to get the two things together, by bringing in guest speakers and talking to journalists they're doing the solutions approach, and trying to bring that, combined with our research, into how we're teaching the students and what we're learning from the students as they're putting all this together.
And conversely, we need the researchers. We need to learn from what they are finding. It helps us to shape our programs, and it also helps us to make our case to funders.
Okay, there's a question from Marianne. I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I have lots of questions, but I think for now, I'll pick up a thread that Karen asked at the end of her presentation, which was about peace or solutions journalism being practiced mostly in Europe, or more visible in Europe and in North America, and not necessarily in other parts of the world. And I'm wondering if within the solutions journalism network, there's any talk of kind of decolonizing the framework, and maybe even journalism in general is kind of a colonial approach to narrating what's happening in the world. And specifically, for example, like when I was in Mozambique, I did the media analysis there, And if you just read the official government newspaper, you think, wow, this is peace journalism or solutions journalism. They're talking about maternal mortality and what they're doing to fix it. They're talking about HIV and how they're limiting the spread of HIV. And really then you look and it's like, oh, well, these are all the development agenda items that European and North American countries are funding and are hoping that they're going to see solutions on. Whether or not they're actually successful or what's behind that isn't necessarily completely accurate. And then non-government organs would spend a lot of time criticizing the government, but also with the danger or with the caveat that they had to toe a very careful line. And even if they showed solutions that were outside of what the government was doing, that maybe civil society organizations and things like that were doing, they could actually endanger themselves or endanger the activists because they were doing better than the government was. So taking into account these kinds of issues that journalists might be facing in different contexts, I'm wondering if there's any conversation within solutions journalism about that.
Thank you for that question, Marianne. Yeah, we have actually a huge global program. I think Karen may be a little bit out of date, but we have very strong programs in Nigeria, Kenya, and spreading into Uganda and Rwanda. We have a network of hundreds of journalists in Latin America, and we have a Latin America coordinator who lives in Caracas. And we have dozens of trainers in India who are working in various places, most of them outside major cities. We have some in the Middle East and North African region, but we are training journalists from all around the world and people who are working in their own newsrooms or who are freelancers and building businesses training solutions journalism themselves. We have institutions teaching solutions journalism in Mongolia, in Nepal, in a lot of countries where you would not expect to find it, and we have a big emphasis on spreading this globally. And I have to say that very few of those people are people we've reached out to. In almost all cases, they've come to us and said, we want to do this in our country. We need this in our country. And the problems that you highlighted in Mozambique are so unfortunate and so common, and they really apply to all journalism, but especially solutions journalism has a high burden in those countries to make sure it's distinguished from government PR, as you mentioned. The official newspaper looks like solutions journalism, but it no doubt is not. I bet they're not covering the limitations, and they're probably their evidence is a little bit shaky. But it also can be a way in for journalists who are really under very strict censorship to write about problems through the framework of a solution. And it's a sneaky way of doing that. But it can be done sometimes when you can't do a straight out problem focused story.
And that's what our study ended in 2020, or was studies up until 2020, and a lot has changed since then. And we were really just looking at the research that was being done in other cultural contexts. But as Karen alluded to, one of the biggest things is, as we're doing the research and the practice, figuring out how this applies in different governmental systems, including how, as Karen said, how it can be co-opted or translated differently depending on the context which it's put in, which we've seen a lot of growth in, but definitely still an ongoing question.
Okay, so I will take another question from the chat. How does solution journalism operate within the context of conflict, like the ongoing war in Gaza, particularly when the user-generated content on social media vividly portrays the harsh realities on the ground?
Such a great
question.
Yeah. I don't know that there's much solutions journalism coming out of Gaza right now. I think the journalists who are there are really focusing on the harsh realities, as you're saying. It's often something that kicks in a little later. And there may be occasional stories about, the hospital that is still working despite whatever, a town that's managing to feed itself. But in the beginning of a conflict, there is usually very little solutions journalism, and reporters are really consumed by what's going on. That is not solutions focused. But if Kaiser or Karen or anybody else has something to add, that would be great.
That's where I was interested in learning more about the visual side of peace journalism and what's been found there, especially, again, when we think of user-generated content on social media, we're thinking about the visuals that are coming through and how that kind of fits into peace journalism.
Okay. Karen, would you like to add something to this question or?
No, that's okay. We can go to the next one.
Okay, then Gloria has a question. Go ahead.
Hello. Hello, greetings everyone. My name is Gloria from Uganda. Well, thank you so much. I've been struggling always to join you, but I have very poor network where I live in Kampala. I want to thank all the presenters, the panelists. Particularly, I am really impressed with the findings, the research findings. I am an action or I am a field journalist. I'm a field peace journalist. And many times we are in the field reporting, but we tend to miss out so many issues. We just report there in the local community, but we tend to miss out so many things. But from the research reports and the findings that colleagues have presented here, I have come to realize that there are so many areas that we've not been able to report well. For example, I do a lot of I do a lot of peace journalism, and I try to link it with solution journalism. Yes, however, what I see lacking in my reporting is how do we, like integrate these other themes? For example, peace journalism, solution journalism, and health reporting. Peace journalism, solution journalism, and refugee reporting. Peace journalism, solution journalism, and war reporting. For example, we have conflict in Western Uganda, the ADF conflict. So we've been having that, that gap. And this brings me to raise a concern to the researchers. These are beautiful research findings. However, if you could always try to share so that some of us who are in the local community, we will be able to read the research and see where we are lacking, where we are not doing well, and we improve. It is only from your research that make us the field journalists to improve and do better. It's like a wake-up call for us. So if we don't receive them, for example, from this network, from this meeting here, my kind request, you share those findings with us. We share with our local media organization. We have our radio managers, our media association, our network. We share, then we check ourselves and, we check ourselves. What have we not done well? How can we improve on our field-based reporting? So this is the kind of, appreciation and a request if you can share some of those findings to different media outlets worldwide. This way we can improve. And also maybe we could also go further. Next week I'll be talking about the kind of work we do. You could go further and target the university, the mass communication department, the final year students. If there is a way, a summary of those research can be given to the final year students so that they are able to go to the newsroom when they are prepared on how to link or what do they need to do to report in a way that peace journalism is moving on well. At the same time, solution journalism is being done perfectly because the newsroom is so demanding. Thank you so much.
Okay, so would anyone like to answer? Or shall I ask Gloria to repeat her question very briefly, maybe?
Well, no, it is a challenge, and especially I think Karen feels this too. As former journalists, we're used to writing something and it appearing in print that day or the next day, and the academic research process is slower, and sometimes it is harder to get the findings out there to the people that really need and want to see them. And some of the things we've been trying to do are work with organizations like the Constructive Institute and Solutions Journalism Network and others who can write about the findings and help us get that out there. We've tried putting white papers together that we can provide to practitioners or anyone that's interested in that. And so it's just kind of trying to continue that outreach. And as you know, we continue working with journalists in our research, I think that's been kind of one of the questions we've been asking is how can we get this information back out to you? So thank you for that.
And Gloria, check out Kaiser's public bibliography if you haven't, because that's another place where you can go find the research.
Maybe we have the time for one more question, probably, because we have only 5 minutes before ending the session. So does anyone have any question they would like to ask the panelists?
There's a question in the chat.
Question. So there's a comment, I think, from Catherine. I don't know if this is a question, but I'll read it anyway. So I heard the question differently. It's not about the number of locations or geographical reach. It's about the biases we, Western media and journalists, hold when we describe, interview, choose what we think are relevant angles. That's the comment on the earlier question regarding decolonization.
Catherine, can you say more about that?
Okay.
I do know that she is in transit and has like your reception, so maybe she's trying to get on. Can I ask a question while we're waiting to see if Catherine can come?
She just wrote in the chat that she's in transit, so she cannot probably hear well.
Well, one of the things though that when I introduce constructive journalism and solutions journalism to my students is to help them understand the context from which they were birthed, and to help understand the U.S. system and the Nordic system of thought, and we sort of deconstruct it to see, okay, this makes sense in how constructive journalism kind of went this way and solutions journalism goes this way, within again the governmental context and cultural context. And I think that's something that continues to need to be understood, and again, as we're trying to apply them in other contexts as well.
Did Karen have a final question?
Yeah, if it's okay, I have a question about so maybe for Gloria or Ali, or if there's anybody else here who's in Africa or has knowledge. So when I interviewed journalists in Uganda about solutions journalism and constructive journalism, and this was in 2019, so it's a little while ago. One journalist told me something that stuck with me. He said that Uganda is not ready for solutions journalism. He said that, basically the journalism as a field is, much newer in Uganda than it is, for example, in a place like the US. And in the US, the audience is so sick of hearing about all the problems that they already know about that they're ready to hear about some solutions. But he said in Uganda, the audience is not done hearing about all the problems. The audience still doesn't know about a lot of the problems. And so we still need to be reporting on the problems. We're not ready to start focusing on the solutions. And so I'm just curious, Gloria or Ali or anyone else, what's your take on that? Would you agree or disagree?
Hello? Yeah, maybe I can try to respond, then Ali can add if he has something to say. The media generally in Uganda, it is still very young. That I agree, it is young. And we also, because of being young, we lack training, specialized training in a number of areas. Year in, year out, we are graduating so many journalism students from different universities, from media institutions, and quite a number are just coming from secondary school into the newsroom. What does that mean? It means they lack training in specialized reporting. And now we have the digital migration in place. Now we again have AI in place. So it means we have a long way to go. And also, again, in summary, it depends where that journalist is based. If he is based in Kampala, they are more exposed. And when he's based in rural Uganda, we have a lot of challenges in rural Uganda. So briefly, that is what I can say. The media is still young, but we are also heading there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I think
Thank you, Gloria. If I add one more word is, I would say yes. Yeah, especially where I am come from, Somalia. We always focus on the problem, reporting the daily news events, and we are not ready and for journalism solution or journalism based journalism, or even the ethical journalism, because there is some gap of earning from journalism or from the media. The journalists are struggling. They don't pay well, so they believe that they can benefit from reporting problems only. So according to that one, I would say yes, that issue is there.
Thanks.
well, I think we have to end now the session. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will pass the floor to Babak to conclude and maybe invite you to the next webinar as well.
Thank you again, everyone, for your participation. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for moderating. I just wanted to let everyone know next week is on lessons from the Global South. So Gloria and 3 other speakers will actually present on these issues we just ended off with. So please join us again. We're out of time. Thank you very much, everyone.